Hello, Eugene Robinson is columnist and associate editor of the Washington Post, but the Committee 100 would like to most memorable impression of his achievement is that he was a participant with the Committee 100's delegations program, where we took Eugene to China for his very first trip. It was a big undertaking. So, Eugene, I'm sure that many of your impressions will be reflected in your remarks today.
I'll tell the truth about these C-100 trips, so we get to the bottom. Thanks so much, Edgy. This is, I think C-100 is a great organization, and I'm very happy to be here this afternoon with a great panel. We get the fun part. We get to talk politics. And so we don't have to be sober and measured in what we say. In fact, there are no proprietary trade secrets except some Gallup secret sauce about how you do the polls. And I have a great panel here, so let me introduce them first, and then I'll just talk for a couple of minutes. To my immediate left, Andrew Dugan, who is an advanced design and analytics analyst at Gallup.
Quite a mouthful.
Yeah, it's a mouthful, and there's some danger in having Andrew here because he might introduce actual facts on which to base our discussion. That's often a problem, but we'll see. To his left, Orville Schell, who's the Arthur Ross Director of the Center on U.S. China Relations, Asia Society. I know him as one of the great journalists and one of the great writers about Asia and China of our time. I've followed his work for many, many years. To his left, Senator Tim Kaine from the Commonwealth of Virginia, who may get to explain to us how the U.S. Senate works.
Doesn't work.
It doesn't work.
Yeah.
Okay, that was short and sweet. To his left is Neil Newhouse, who is partner and co-founder of Public Opinion Strategies, and another expert in public opinion, another one who might burden us with facts and research, but we can stand that. And finally, at the far end of the stage, Stuart Kuo, who's president and executive director of the Asian Pacific American Legal Center. I guess I will start just with a few thoughts and observations. So we're going to talk about the U.S.-China relationship and politics and media and how perceptions really affect that relationship and affect public opinion in both countries, and with emphasis on the presidential campaigns, because we just had one here, as you might know, and it seems to me that this was a particularly interesting contrast because here you had a Republican challenger, Mitt Romney, who, unburdened by office, was able to China bash pretty much at will for currency manipulation and whatever. And you had a sitting president who, because he was a sitting president, President Obama, was more constrained in his in what he says about world events, because presidents speaking loosely about world events can create all sorts of problems. So I have to ask myself whether this is that contrast in the rhetoric that we were hearing from the candidates is part of the reason why, according to exit polls, Asian Americans voted nearly 3-1 for President Obama over Mitt Romney. Now, I think actually that there are a lot of reasons why that might have been the case, and I also realize that there are a lot of different groups that make up a group called Asian Americans. But I would just throw out, for the sake of argument, that to the extent that China is portrayed as an evil empire by politicians and the echo chamber of the media, to the extent that that happens, that is likely to alienate those who portray China in that way to Chinese American voters, and likely to cement in the current alignment, the increasing allegiance of Asian American voters to the Democratic Party. And I would also submit that probably kind of works the same way in China with Chinese public opinion. So just with that, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to give brief opening remarks, and then we'll have a bit of a dialogue, and then we'll open it up to questions. So, Andrew?
Okay, thank you very much, and I just want to say it's a privilege to be on this panel with all these esteemed experts. And as the Gallup analyst, I will be predictably starting with a statistic, this one being 52%, which is the percentage of Americans that view China either mostly or very unfavorably, according to our latest poll, which was conducted in February of this year. This is in line with current trends that has seen a majority of Americans rate China unfavorably. And I think the poll reaffirms China's place as a nation viewed warily by most U.S. adults. I believe there are 6 key points to take away from Gallup's rich history on polling on this subject, and we've been polling about China in some extent or another since 1979. So we have a rich database of knowledge that we can draw upon to try and understand where we are in terms of U.S.-Chinese relations, where we have been, and perhaps where we might go. So as I said, 6 points, and the number one fact, I would say, is more than any single fact are the events at Tiananmen Square, which of course were broadcasted widely here in the United States, caused Americans' opinions of China to sour in a very big way. Prior to this event, as many as 72% of U.S. adults saw China favorably, which I think a lot of people would find surprising. 72%, this was in the Cold War. China was officially a communist nation, but still 72% saw the nation favorably then. After Tiananmen Square, in a second poll in late 1989, which again was after the event, we found those favorable ratings crater to 34% and 54% disapproving. And following Tiananmen Square, nearly every Gallup poll on this question, which have been conducted on a regular basis in the 1990s and once a year from 2000 onward, has shown more Americans disapproving of China than not, albeit with varying levels of intensity. From 1991 to 2000, China's unfavorable rating never dipped below 47% and has always exceeded their favorable rating. Point 2 is, generally speaking, however, in the 2000s, opinions began to soften, and China's net favorability rating tightened up considerably, which is to say that U.S. adults became more evenly divided on the Middle Kingdom rather than overwhelmingly opposed. The apex of China's favorability came in February 2007, when 48% of Americans gave the country a favorable recommendation, the highest score since before Tiananmen Square. The gains were short-lived, however. Since 2008, China's net favorable rating has become yet again strongly negative, and I think will be a topic of much discussion for this panel. Point 3 is, and this is quite interesting, point 3 is Republicans have been at the forefront of this new wave of unfavorable feelings. Republicans are far less likely to see China favorably, with 32% of Republicans versus 52% of Democrats seeing China positively, a gap of 20 percentage points between the parties. Similarly, the percentage of Republicans saying they view China unfavorably has risen by 15 percentage points from 2008 to 2013, far outpacing the general population, or the general adult population. Point 4 is that even though the American economy is currently double the size of China's, 53% of Americans say China is the leading economic power today. This marks the 3rd time in a row since 2010 that a majority has judged China as the world's preeminent economic power. There is a bit of a partisan divide here. 57% of Republicans say this is so, while a lesser 48% of Democrats agree. And some of this may be politics, as you might say, and dissatisfaction with the current occupant of the White House. In 2008, the last full year of Republican George W. Bush's presidency, only a little more than a third of Republicans believed China was the superior economy. And again, that compares to 57% today. Likewise, the percentage of Democrats now saying the U.S. is the best economy has climbed 10 percentage points from 2008, standing at 36% today. But I should say that Democrats continue to see China as the better performing economy and have for pretty much from 2008 onward. Relatedly, most Americans see China's economy as, quote, a critical threat. This is the first time we asked that question, by the way, and 51% said that China's economy is, quote, a critical threat. Previous Gallup polls have also found a significant portion of Americans stating they are very concerned about the impact trade relations with China is having on the U.S. economy. So that's an issue of sensitivity as well. Point number 5 is, for the first time on record, a majority of Americans assess the military power of China as a critical threat. About 6 in 10 Republicans believe China's military is a threat, and this is interesting because Republicans are far more likely than Democrats and the general population in general to place a huge emphasis on the need for the American military to be the predominant force on the globe. So in that sense, it may not be surprising that more so than the Democrats or the general population see China's military as a threat. A little less than half of Democrats think so as well. This poll predates the widely read investigative report and has already been talked about by other speakers today about the cyber attacks that were traced by the New York Times to the Chinese military. And tangentially, but I think somewhat related, our survey was also conducted before the latest and perhaps most ostentatious round of North Korean saber rattling, and China's support both militarily and otherwise for this confrontational and tyrannical regime, which has only a 12% favorability rating with the American public, is probably not helpful to U.S. perceptions of China.
Who are those 12%?
I was wondering that myself. I cannot say, but 12% does seem high for them.
Dennis Rodman and...
Finally, my last point is, and I hope that this is a hopeful one, I believe, it's worth noting that despite much uneasiness, Americans' views of China are not especially negative or should necessarily stand in the way of a closer relationship between the two countries. And I think the best example here is Mexico, our southern neighbor and a top trading partner. Mexico is viewed only marginally more favorably than China, 47% to 43%. A difference of 4 percentage points. Yet Mexico and the U.S. have a close relationship, including a free trade agreement. Nor is China the least liked country among a group of countries listed in our poll, which may sound like small comfort, but it is an important distinction because it reveals that Americans do not regard China in the same light that they do, for example, Iran or North Korea. So while there is work to be done, I think this poll shows that it's not hopeless, I guess would be the takeaway message there. And transitioning to very quickly, I know I'm limited on time, to a separate topic, is I just wanted to briefly mention Gallup's research into the political preferences of Asian Americans. Gallup has what we call our daily tracking. We introduced it in January of 2008, and we interview approximately 1,000 U.S.-based individuals on a nightly basis. And as Eugene noted, Asian Americans, of course, is an umbrella term for a wide variety of countries and heritages one might come from, and we don't actually specifically ask an individual what their country of heritage is. But nonetheless, this allows us to amass a large sample of interviews with Asian American adults, over 30,000 throughout the time span of Gallup's daily tracking, that has not been available to pollsters beforehand. The bottom line is Asian Americans are currently a reliable voting bloc for the Democratic Party, with 57% of all Asian Americans either identifying or leaning towards the Democratic Party in terms of party registration, according to the aggregated 2012 data. 28% instead identify or lean with the GOP, and another 13% are pure independents. Put simply, Asian Americans are yet another minority group with which the Republican Party is currently uncompetitive, despite the fact that Asian Americans do strongly share some features of what we would call a typical Republican supporter, namely earning high incomes. However, Republicans are failing to connect, and if anything, this data underplays the challenge facing the GOP, as CNN's exit poll data, Gallup doesn't have exit poll data, CNN's exit poll data says that Obama won this group by a 72 to 26% margin, which was even higher than our party registration gap. Another interesting fact is Asian Americans are, generally speaking, very young. A commanding 56% of adult Asian Americans aged between 18 to 34 are commanding 56% of adult Asian Americans are between the ages of 18 to 34, which makes them the youngest group of any U.S. racial or ethnic group that Gallup analyzes. And this could be important, you might think, because middle-aged and older Asian Americans are slightly more likely to lean towards the GOP than their younger counterparts. And this might suggest that the pro-democratic sympathies currently held by young Asian Americans will be tempered a bit in time and resemble that of their older counterparts. But even if this were to happen, that would be of marginal benefit to the Republican Party because they're performing very weakly among all three age categories. And on the other hand, and this is quite interesting, one thing that might keep Asian Americans in the Democratic Party's camp is that they are more likely than any other racial or ethnic category to list their religion or describe their religion, if you prefer, as, quote, non-atheist or agnostic. According to the aggregated data, 25% of Asian Americans describe themselves as non-religious versus 14% of Hispanics, 12% of blacks, and 16% of non-Hispanic whites. Religiosity is highly predictive of which major political party a person will support. Gallup editor-in-chief and my esteemed boss, Frank Newport, included as what he calls the 3 R's: religion, race, and rings, the last one referring to whether or not you're married, with which, should you know the answer to those questions, you can estimate with a probability of nearly 1 as to which presidential candidate a voter would have supported. In particular, non-religious individuals are very unlikely to support the Republican Party or Mitt Romney when he ran as their candidate. And according to CNN's exit poll, Romney lost the group 70 to 26%. Insomuch that the lack of religion or religiosity among Asian Americans is a barrier for Republicans in successfully attracting their political support, this could portend a long-term problem for the GOP. The youngest Asian Americans, which as we just noted is the largest cohort, are the least religious, and should those convictions remain intact throughout the remainder of their lives, it could prove an insurmountable obstacle for the GOP.
Thank you, Andrew. Orville, and let me mention that Orville has to catch a plane, so he's going to be leaving. He won't be leaving in disgust. He's just leaving because he has to, so he'll have to leave soon. So,
I beg all of your indulgence. I'm sorry I'll miss the discussion. This is a very interesting topic because it sits very much at the heart of this great undertaking that Professor Brzezinski described of the U.S. and China trying to find some workable angle of repose after a very, very long and quite fraught history. And I think it's listening to your numbers from Gallup. I'm impressed by the sort of the paradox, in a way, of China's success. We've heard much of late about the China dream that President Xi Jinping has spoken of. And I think what that China dream really suggests is that there has been this long historical yearning for China to regain status in the world and regain respect of those powers, which were bullying it for many, many decades, occupying it, preying upon it in various ways. And I think the presumption always was that if they could only stop being you remember the sick man of Asia. It wasn't so long ago when I first started to study China. It was literally that decade before. That if they could overcome that affliction, respect would follow. And I think this is sort of what we're talking about here is the perception of China outside. That's one side of the equation. And why has it been so elusive in terms of China being able to gain a more favorable perception of its enterprise when, after these extraordinary 30 years of economic reform, China has done what nobody thought it would possibly be able to do? When I first went there in 1975 and worked on a model agricultural brigade and then in a Shanghai factory, there wasn't one scintilla of evidence to suggest that what has come to pass would come to pass. And if you had stood as I did in 1989 out in front of Tiananmen watching 1 million people flood into Tiananmen Square. You could not have imagined that the Chinese Communist Party would have gotten the genie back in the bottle and been able to bring about the period of dynamic economic growth it ultimately did. So why then, we are left to ask, is China still somehow missing something in terms of the sort of favorable perception that I think is a deep part of the Chinese dream that President Xi has been speaking of? And I think very quickly, I'll just try to sketch a few areas that I think are responsible here. First of all, I'd have to say on the American side, there's an abysmal ignorance, not just about China, but about the world. I think we live in a society presently where our education is failing us in the most radical and dangerous way in terms of making us more aware of what's going on in the world outside. I would have to say, even though I exist in the media, as you do, Gene, and others on this panel, I think the media has failed Americans abysmally. When you think that we own the public airwaves, all the networks, there isn't a single network with a regular correspondent in Beijing except for CNN. You look at Xinhua or the People's Daily, they have people, I don't know how many hundreds spread around America and the world. We're paying a bitter price, I think, for this sort of ignorance. On the other side, however, I very much agree with what Dan Rosen suggested earlier about foreign Chinese investment here. It's a two-way street. The problems that China confronts in America are not simply American ignorance, although God knows we have enough of that to go around. I think their passion to somehow acquire soft power bespeaks of this yearning I alluded to earlier. But I think it also, everybody can see that it is incomplete. It isn't quite working, despite the enormous amount of money invested in it, the enormous amount of attention and ardor. So what's wrong? I mean, besides the things I suggested on the American side of the ledger. Well, I think, if you look at the media, which really is the way human beings continue their education after they leave school, we have some very serious problems. The media that does exist, the serious media, and there are a lot of them in China now, Americans, Europeans, it probably has the largest foreign press corps, I think, of any other country in the world, with the possible exception of this city. I think that if you look at the two notions of what the media are in China and the West, they're totally different. Go back to 1942, read Chairman Mao's Yan'an Forums on the art and literature, where he lays it out. Art, literature, media, in those days was reporters, are megaphones of the party and the state. And that's never been counteracted, countermanded. So that means there's a very, very different notion of what the role of the media should be in China. Now, it's changed a great deal, but still that basic template is so far away from the template of what the media is in the West. Independent, free, although not always so free, diverse, owing no favor to anyone, speaking on behalf of no one, trying to be the watchdog for society. So here is a basic contradiction. And it very much manifests itself when you are in China as a member of the media. And remember, these people, these several hundred people, are the avenue through which the world really understands China. You can criticize them as prejudiced, as this, that, and the other, but you also, I think, need to look at the way in which they experience China. And in many cases, the system of controls, which grows out of the old Maoist model of media, is something that they deeply chafe under. If you look at the question of journalists being able to get visas, there's always a handful or more of journalists who just can't get in. Now, United States, Europe doesn't deny visas to people on political grounds mostly, nor should they, in my view. This is an area which does pollute the well of perception by making an added sort of impediment, an irritant to a smoother reaction between China and the world that is facilitated by the media. And then, of course, we have the problem, which is not going to be solved easily at all. We have two very, very politically different systems. Now, Chinese acknowledge that. We acknowledge that. That's just something we're going to have to kind of deal with. But I would say something as a kind of a coda to that thought. If you look at plans historically for how China is evolving, you go back to Sun Yat-sen, for instance, and almost everyone since, there was this notion that China would slowly evolve through stages. They would start with what they called Junzheng, which is military rule. Then they would go to Xunzheng, which is guided democracy. And then finally they would evolve to constitutionalism. When? A bit vague. I think that what we see in China today, by way of understanding this situation, is this transition, more protracted than people thought originally, but nonetheless underway. The media is also in this process, but it is incomplete. And so I think these two things really sit at the heart of the kind of irritation which tends to cloud our ability to, I think, appreciate where China has been startlingly successful. And I should say, in my view, no amount of public relations can take care of these problems. You can't go out and buy soft power. Soft power arises spontaneously. And this, I think, actually is the challenge. I very much view China at this point as coming to the end of an act of a play. They've acted out a script to a certain point. There's a new act beginning, but nobody knows what the script is going to be. And whether anyone is going to be able to write it is an interesting question. Someone will have to write it, or it will write itself. And in that script, I think that these kinds of challenges that exist as really unnecessary irritants between these two worlds that are trying so urgently to get together to solve the world's problems do beg our attention, and they are finally what's going to condition how we look at China, and indeed how China looks at us, which is a very complicated mixture, I think, of attraction, repulsion, fascination, and uncertainty. So stay tuned. This story is a really interesting story, and we are by no means at the end of it. I think what we want to ask ourselves is, what can be done to make the next chapter somewhat more successful so we don't end up with the scenario that Dr. Brzezinski started out with: rising power, clashing with existing power, and a global nightmare. So listen, with those thoughts, I think I'll end now. If you will please forgive me, I feel rather sheepish to steal off the stage here. But
it's okay. We'll talk about you when you're done.
Very good. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Orwell.
Cheers.
Thanks. And stay tuned for the professor's next book, I hope, in which he might answer some of those questions. Our next act is Senator Kaye.
So I'm no expert, and I'm a member of an institution whose popularity is below the North Korea numbers that were cited.
Yeah, exactly. I noticed.
But I know something about campaigns. So in 2010, I was chairman of the Democratic National Committee and saw campaigns all over the United States. And in 2012, was running in one of the most competitive United States Senate races. And I think I can say, and this is not really much of an exaggeration, in the 2010 and 2012 cycles, every reference to China in political advertisements in this country was negative. People would be criticized because they had voted for policies that had shipped jobs to China. People had been lobbyists and they had lobbied for Chinese interests. People had been in office and had spent a ton of money, and that had led us to be in debt to China. And these were ads and messages that were equal opportunity. Gene made some points about the presidential race, but if you look at it more broadly, there were Democratic candidates China bashing, just like there were Republican candidates China bashing. China in the 2010 and 2012 campaign cycles was pretty much about as reliable a punching bag where you could get an applause line as there was. So why is that? Well, first, it's not always been like that. Dr. Brzezinski touched upon this, but I think this is important to answer the question. There's a historian in Richmond where I live, Gene Trani, whose real expertise is Soviet foreign policy, but he wrote a book with another historian, Don Davis, and here was the working title of the book, Why Do Americans Love China and Hate Russia? I think he decided that he'd sell more books with that title, but it was a slight overstatement, so he changed the title to Distorted Mirrors. But the book that was published in 2009 basically looked at U.S. China interaction from 1890 to today and U.S. Russia Soviet Union interaction from 1890 to today, and made the point that the United States generally, citizens have had a fascination with China, that the relationship has been more positive than the relationship with Russia and the Soviet Union. And the book tried to tackle that disharmony. Why was that in fact the case? So the history has not been that China was always the negative. And even today, economic trends, China top 3 trading partner along with Canada and Mexico. That's for the country. It's also for Virginia. Many efforts to try to do work together with China. When I was governor of Virginia, one of the things that we worked on very diligently, and many of you can thank me for this, I was part of the team that got united to start daily air service from Washington to Beijing on the theory that the 2 most important capitals in the world should have a daily transportation connection. So all the ads were bad in 10 and 12, and yet the history's often been pretty good, and there's some evidence that suggests that there's a lot of good going on. So what explains China being a political punching bag? And just offer 2 thoughts and then an opportunity. First, there's an American anxiety about not being number 1. Everybody in this room knows if in a stray Winter Olympics we don't have the most gold medals, we get depressed. We get depressed. And the United States economy has been the largest economy in the world since when? When did the U.S. economy become the largest economy in the world? A lot of people think World War I, World War II. 1890. We've been the largest economy in the world since 1890. Well, it's clear because of China's population and incredible growth and productivity that there's going to be a day when China's GDP will be larger than ours. And it's not that American citizens look at GDP statistics every morning at the breakfast table, but we kind of have a sense of we don't like to be number 2. And there's an American anxiety that is, often an inchoate, not particularly mature sometimes, but an anxiety where if somebody is overtaking us, we get depressed and then we view them with suspicion. We're going to have to grow up and understand that our GDP may not always be number 1 in the world, and yet we can still have a perfectly wonderful society. So that's on us to try to get over that anxiety. But the second reason for the change in perception, China being a punching bag in political campaigns, is Chinese behavior. Now, if this were something about how Chinese view Americans, I'm sure there would be American behavior we could talk about. But the Chinese behaviors that cause the most angst on Capitol Hill are things like intellectual property theft and piracy. Cybersecurity, very serious. I met recently with a foreign-born chief executive of a major global corporation and just asked innocently about cybersecurity and heard the individual just tell about the daily battles that they face with it. And they're very, very good at what they do in tracing the origin of the cybersecurity attacks. And the overwhelming majority of those attacks originate in China. And yet the official position from the government, the Chinese government in these attacks, is no, that's not the case. They're not from China. This is a huge irritant. Intellectual property, trade, cybersecurity, and even to some degree, and when we talk about North Korea, there's a sense on the Capitol, if North Korea is doing something bellicose, developing nuclear weapons, there's one party that can tell them to stop. And if they are being bellicose, it's because that party has not told them to stop. And I credit what Dr. Brzezinski said. There's been some very strong Chinese moves recently on this. So Americans have to wrestle with this anxiety. But I think there's some behaviors on the Chinese side that need attention, and we need to call diplomatically and in the relationship for those behaviors to be changed. But the last thing I'll say and then turn it over is I think there's also some opportunities for us. When the U.S. and the Soviet Union were vying for military superiority, everything fit into that framework. We did international development to try to get people on our side, and the Soviet Union did international development to try to get people on their side, and it was largely a competition to try to get military allies that was often a very ruthless competition. We're in a competition now with China, but it's an economic competition. I don't think it has to be so ruthless as the U.S.-Soviet Union competition. And I think we need to look for opportunities to do surprising things together. I was in the audience when President Obama gave his State of the Union speech this year, and he announced this very bold goal, the kind of things we Americans like to say: let's eradicate extreme poverty in the globe in the next 2 decades. Let's all together, not just the U.S., but let's do it together. And the metric around that is preventable child deaths for children under age 5, and hunger, measures of hunger. You can measure these things society to society. You can know whether you're getting better or know whether you're getting worse. What a wonderful thing it would be for a U.S. and a China, the 2 dominant economies in the world today, to say, this is something we're going to work on together. We're not going to compete against each other to try to get people to be on our side or their side, as was the case in the U.S.-Soviet era. But we're going to announce jointly that we will tackle this problem together. We both have expertise. We both have resources. We both have presence all over the globe. Let's do something together. I think the power of the U.S. and China doing something together in the humanitarian realm, and I've given you an example, but there could be others, doing something together in the humanitarian realm could be so potentially transformative in this century. And as a member of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, it's something that I would love to be able to explore and work on in my time in the Senate. So with that, I'll stop and look forward to talking and answering questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator. Thank you. Yes. Neil.
Gene, thank you. This represents kind of 2 firsts for me. Gene, this is the first time in probably 2.5 years I haven't been introduced as Mitt Romney's pollster. I'm not sure whether that was error of omission. Who knows? And the other thing is, this is probably the first time this group, the C100 group, has been spoken to back to back by 2 guys from Overland Park, Kansas, which is we both hail from. How the hell he got at Overland Park, Kansas as a Democrat and to end up being the DNC chairman, I will never know. But anyway, I survived as a Republican. My mission, though, I look at this as the topic here was talking about China and the presidential campaign and how, the image, and the way I approached this, I used a lot of that same Gallup data and some of the spending data. And I formulated this. I think there are 5 myths out there about perceptions about China in this past election. Let me go through these things with you. You find it interesting. First of all, the myth that ads mentioning China played a huge role in the past presidential campaign. Okay, there was $45 million of advertising in the presidential campaign that mentioned China. $45 million. In 2008, there was just $8 million. It's a big deal, but that $45 million was out of $1.3 billion that was spent on advertising the presidential campaign. And 4 years ago, that $8 million was out of about $60 million, or I'm sorry, $120 million spent in the campaign. There is a huge difference in the level of noise that there was in the China campaign. Senator, I think in your Senate campaigns last time, you guys spent probably together $40 million or something like that.
Mm-hmm. The third parties doubled it.
Yeah, I mean, so there were enough China ads, so it would be basically the one entire statewide campaign in Virginia or Ohio or any other state. Mm-hmm. But there were 10 times more advertisements run on jobs in the economy than there was on China. Just 3.75% of all the ads that were run were regarding China. Now, it was interesting, as Gene, as you mentioned, the ads that we went after the Obama campaign on was Obama was not tough enough on China, and his policies encourage the outsourcing of U.S. jobs to countries like China. And believe me, as Senator Kaine said, when when given a choice of different countries to mention when we would write these ads, China always somehow came to the top of the list as one of these targets.
You didn't go for Malaysia.
No, not exactly. And then the Obama campaign came after. I mean, Obama campaign, their hands were not clean in this either, as you know. The Obama campaign tried to make the case that Mitt was a hypocrite for criticizing Obama on China while he also benefited from his Bain investments from outsourcing of jobs to China. I mean, it went back and forth. Both sides got their blows in here. But there was more money spent by Democrats in the Obama campaign attacking Mitt Romney on his Bain connection than there was totally talking about China. Okay, so myth number one is, China may not have played as huge a role in the campaign. Myth number two, okay, that $45 million worth of ads, well, it had a negative impact on China's image in this country. Hell, it had to, right? Well, again, not exactly. Gallup's data. You look at the Gallup data, they do their surveys every February. And I figured, okay, they did it February 2012 and February 2013. If that $45 million worth of advertising had an impact on China's image, it would have dropped between 12 and 13. Makes sense? Well, it actually improved. It went from a net minus 15 image to a minus 9. Slight improvement, but it's improvement. But it's an aberration, right? It's 1 year. Well, following the last 4 presidential campaigns, China's image has been stronger after the election than it was prior to it. So all this garbage you hear about China bashing, it sure as heck doesn't seem to impact China's image. The average pre and post image of China improved 9 points in an election year. 9 points in an election year. Okay. So myth number 3. Well, at least, though, I mean, stepping back from this, we can safely say that the cumulative effect of all this China bashing has hurt China's image in the United States. I mean, look at the 1990s compared to the 2000s. Again, that's not the case. In the 1990s, the image of China was a minus 14 net. In the 2000s, it's minus 9. In the midst of China being one of the key players in U.S. elections, the image of the country in American eyes has actually improved. So myth number 4. Well, okay, but we all know it's lower income Americans, it's the lower educated Americans who are the most susceptible to the China bashing attacks, and they're the ones they're moved by this stuff. They're the ones less likely to trust China. It is the U.S. opinion elite that are more global in their views and more accepting of China. Well, if the question is trust, a Pew survey done just last year showed that 26% of Americans in a Pew poll believe the U.S. can trust China. 26% say the U.S. can trust China. But Pew also interviewed 305 foreign affairs experts. Okay, now, margin of error in 305 foreign affairs experts. Well, margin of error in one foreign affairs expert, could be a lot. 305, who knows? But they found of the government experts, 26% trust China, say the U.S. should trust China. Retired military, 31%. Business and trade experts, 27%. Scholars were the highest at 34%. 31% of the news media. And the bottom line is, it's not just the great unwashed American public. It cuts across the opinion elite in this country the questions of whether the United States can trust China. And this really reinforces a lot of the conversation we've heard, not just from this panel, but from others earlier today. The areas that bother both the experts and the public the most, and there was a convergence on this, and it's 2 specific issues. It wasn't jobs, it wasn't the deficit, but it was the cyber attacks on the U.S. by China and the intellectual property infringement. Those were the highest rated concerns by the foreign affairs experts and matched the public. Finally, myth number 5. Myth number 5 is, the Asian American vote really doesn't make much difference, doesn't count for much in U.S. politics. Okay, well, first understand that, okay, we recognize we lost this election. We recognize we lost it because of Hispanic votes, young voters, African Americans, et cetera. But one of the keys that nobody ever talks about is the Asian American vote. Understand that it's not Hispanics that are the fastest growing immigrant group in the United States, it's Asian voters. Obama won Asians, this point's been mentioned, by 73-26. Okay, so he won them. It's the second highest group to African Americans. Big deal. Well, you know what George H.W. Bush, how he did with Asian Americans when he ran in 1992? 1992, he won by 55-31. There is a net 66-point difference, a 66-point shift in 20 years. In 20 years in allegiance among Asian American voters. These voters accounted for 30% of Obama's winning margin. Unbelievable. And if I were to add I only had 5 myths until I heard Gene's intro. The Gene's intro was you posited that Asian American voters voted for Obama because of Mitt's China bashing, essentially. I would add that to my next myth. Just 6% of Asian American voters say they voted for that foreign policy was their top issue. It was overwhelming the economy in this thing. But here's the bottom line, guys. Bottom line is there may be a lot of huffing and puffing in the presidential elections about China, but it doesn't seem to have impacted voter impact regarding the country. It takes more than $45 million worth of TV ads to change voter impressions on an issue when voters pretty much know where they stand and how they feel. But truth is, bottom line, Americans really do have serious concerns about China. They revolve around what they perceive as unfair trade, but then also it's cyber spying, intellectual property theft. These are real concerns. They're echoed not just from the American public, but from the opinion elite as well. And finally, when it comes to U.S. politics, Chinese Americans count, and they're beginning to count a lot. They're growing in size and allegiance to the Democratic Party. They voted for Obama, by record margins this time. Here's a promise, and this is I can guarantee this one. We'll be hearing a lot more about Asian Americans as a swing constituency in the 2016 and 2020 elections.
There will be.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Neil. That was very informative. That swing from the
Isn't that incredible?
Bush to that's incredible. Yeah.
And it was almost progressive every single election.
Yeah, amazing. Stuart.
Thank you, Gene. I'm also a proud member of the Committee 100, and I'm glad that you went on our educational delegation, and I hope we can send a lot more Americans to make up their minds by seeing China firsthand.
Okay, well, I'll go again. That's okay.
Great.
That's fine. No one wants to go.
Well, some of you were here when the Chinese ambassador was hoping that the coverage of China could be objective, balanced, and enlightened. And I wonder what election he was thinking about in the United States. I was wondering if we could ever have an election where the coverage of anything was balanced, enlightened, et cetera. So, but having said that, when we have tracked the anti-China ads in 2010 through 2012, in 2010, there were at least 29 congressional and senatorial races where there was an anti-China ad of some sort. And some of the headlines during 2012 kind of summed it up. China's slamming campaign ads, anti-China ads continue in 2011 political cycle, China becomes bogeyman in campaign ads, China emerges as a scapegoat in campaign ads, fear-mongering 101 anti-China campaign ads, parties continue to demonize China in campaign ads. The Economist in September 2012 had a headline, Chasing the Anti-China Vote. And unfortunately, these ads, as Senator Kaine said, were from both parties. And so it was sometimes I look at our Senate and our Congress and I think there's going to be something that's going to be bipartisan, and it's probably going to relate to something about anti-China. But I do want to, as an Asian American, I want to talk about the impact beyond the damage in the trust relationship between the Chinese leadership and the American leadership. And that is, some of you remember Vincent Chin, who was killed in 1982 in Detroit, Michigan. And at that time, Japan was the target and the scapegoat. And two white auto workers thought Vincent, who was Chinese American, was Japanese, causing unemployment, and they battered in his head on the eve of his wedding. And so the blaming could have been on Japan, but the targeting for physical violence was on an Asian American. But the stigma goes beyond physical violence. One of our late members, Matt Fong, was running for U.S. Senate in California. And I remember Matt telling me, Matt was, I can't remember, third or fourth generation Californian, and he was a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Air Force. And he was interviewed by a very senior mainstream station. And they said, if there's a conflict between the United States and China, which side will you take? And Matt was flabbergasted. But that stigma of demonizing China has a direct impact on Asian Americans. Mm-hmm. It's not just the U.S. China relationship that suffers, but it is also Asian Americans who are impacted. So what can be done about that? Certainly parties, political leaders like Senator Kaine and others need to say to their parties and candidates, yes, you can talk about China issues, but let's not demonize China. And so I'm very proud that the Committee of 100 came out with a very clear position in, I think it was in late winter of last year. And we said, and we sent this statement to all the parties and all the whole Senate and Congress. And we said, yes, there are a number of issues where the United States and China should have active discourse. And there will be disagreement, and there can be valid criticism. However, what is unacceptable is the use of crude stereotypes, mm-hmm. the use of racial stereotypes, the use of Asian actors who come from California with a heavy Asian accent mocking, and really almost in a way that mocks the Asian language or an accent of an Asian American immigrant. And what we said was that is really unacceptable. And what we said was we ask politicians of all parties to be conscious of the risk that rhetorical attacks on China have led to real attacks on Asian Americans, including Chinese Americans. So yes, there should be a vibrant discussion on whatever differences or commonalities the United States and China has. But that really cannot be denigrated to stereotyping and the mocking of Asian languages. And let me just reinforce something that has been brought up, but hopefully I could add something to the polling. Asian Americans definitely are the fastest growing racial group in the United States of America, not just immigrant groups. We're the fastest growing racial group in the United States of America, percentage-wise greater than Latinos and anybody else. So we have 18 million people, and we are concentrated in some of the largest electoral states. We are growing in some of the swing states. And so let me explain what happened in some of why Asian Americans who are not registered overwhelmingly Democratic are starting to vote more and more on the Democratic side. The Asian Pacific American Legal Center is still tabulating a post-election poll from November 2012. But we did a preliminary sampling, and we found that 82% of Asian American voters thought that the candidates, in this case the presidential candidate's position on immigration, was either very important or somewhat important. I don't think that question, I was asking our demographer, did that question just relate to immigration policy? And I don't think it did. And a poll that our national affiliate, the Asian American Justice Center, did, which was a pre-election poll, solidified that view. In that poll, they said, if a candidate whom you have a strong affinity for on issues comes out with an anti-Asian view, will you vote for that person? And even though the Asian Americans would tend to agree with that candidate on every other issue, if they came out with an anti-Asian view, 51% said they would turn to another candidate. Mm-hmm. And amongst Chinese Americans, it was 62%. So I think that one of the clear messages that we can provide, in these national and local and statewide campaigns, if you want the Asian American vote, you cannot stereotype, you cannot use denigrating language, you cannot use mocking of accents. That is taboo if you want the Asian American vote. And I'm proud to say that the Committee of 100 took the leadership to tell all the candidates of whatever party that if you want our vote, respect us. Respect our culture, respect who we are, and talk about the issues, whether they're international or national, but do not disrespect our race and our people.
Thank you. Thank you, Stuart. I want to just follow up with a question for you, Stuart, and then either of our pollsters. Do the parties or candidates' positions more broadly on immigration have an impact that you discern in the Asian American vote and in the Chinese American vote? In other words, pro-immigration reform better than anti-immigration reform, attitudes about illegal immigration, anything?
Well, some people think that the current immigration policy debate is a Latino issue. It's not. It's also an Asian American issue. It really is an American issue because America has been built on immigrants, and we need to continue having that resource and that combination of families and energy. So 60% of Asian Americans are foreign-born. Only 40% of Latinos are foreign-born in the United States. Okay. So we have a deep, deep interest in immigration, immigration reform. I do think that we had a press conference about 2.5 months before the November election. And at that time, 30% of Asian American voters were undecided. And I suspect that the perceived anti-China, some of the anti-immigrant positions that were associated with Governor Romney affected his campaign.
Well, I would actually disagree with that. If you go back to that same poll, those undecided voters broke exactly the way the decided voters had already said they were going to be. I looked at that poll pretty closely. They broke exactly in the same ratios. So I'm not sure that's the case, but I do agree with you in terms of immigration being an issue. There's no question about it. I mean, and even with Hispanic voters, I mean, it's difficult to kind of sort through exactly what drove these voters. I mean, for Latinos, our surveys showed that immigration was kind of a gatekeeper issue, but the issue they most agreed with Obama on was healthcare reform. And that's what drove those. Yeah, I mean, that's a. So I mean, it's a combination of these different things. I'm sure immigration played a role, but I think I looked at those pre and post numbers; they broke exactly the same way. So,
Senator, do you want to add?
And I had noticed an interesting thing in 2005 when I ran for governor in Virginia. There was not ads or questions about immigration reform at the federal level, but there were attacks against me in my campaign on, Kane is soft on illegal immigrants. And they would use pictures, and all the pictures would focus on Latinos. But what I noticed was new Americans who saw those ads of whatever nationality would conclude it's not really the illegal that he's being attacked for, it's the immigrant that he's being attacked for. And so in Virginia, while Latinos had been pretty strong Democrats, many of the Asian American populations, Filipino Americans, pretty strong in Virginia, Vietnamese Americans, Chinese Americans, Pakistani Americans, had tended to be Republican voters. But as soon as there were canes soft on illegal immigrants with pictures of Latinos, we started to see real shifts in Asian American populations in Virginia that had been Republican voters starting to move over into the Democratic camp, because again, their thought was, well, they may be saying it's about the illegal and they may be saying it's about Latinos, but what they're really attacking is anybody who is pro-immigrant, and we're new Americans, we're immigrants, and so we're going to start to shift loyalties. And we saw that in 2005. And then interestingly enough, in my race in 2012, my opponent didn't do anything on immigration, didn't attack immigration reform, immigration to the degree that there was an issue that we sort of agreed on, that we ought to do comprehensive work and bipartisan work. Immigration was one of the issues that was non-controversial in 2012.
He got that in Virginia. Unless you have something specifically on that point, I was going to move to something else. It was interesting that, Senator, that you mentioned those specific issues of cyber security and intellectual property. And so here's a confession. I went on this wonderful Committee of 100 trip, and so we're in Beijing, and had a meeting with the spokesman of the Chinese Foreign Ministry, who was gracious enough to give us a lot of time, and we had a very nice dinner, and it was really quite productive. You go into those sessions as a journalist and thinking this is really going to be, not going to be the most helpful, but it was very helpful. And so at the end, he and his colleagues present us with a little gift, and it is a thumb drive. That is, and it's beautiful. I mean, it's got the characters on it, and it's red, and it's got a tassel and everything, and it's this beautiful thing. And I get it back to my hotel, and I say, there is just no way in God's earth I'm going to plug this into my computer. I'm not going to do this. Now, if I had been given a very nice, engraved thumb drive by the U.S. State Department, I wouldn't plug that into my computer either, okay? And ditto for about any...
And Gene, if I gave you one, you wouldn't either, right?
No, absolutely. Nobody on this panel can get this thing. But I sat there in my hotel room in Beijing thinking, okay, examining my thoughts about that. Clearly, it was out of the question, right? This wasn't going into my computer, but am I hung up on this issue, and am I justified? And I kind of am, because that's so. And from your perch as a senator, are we getting anywhere on these issues, do you think?
Well, I will say, and I was interested in, this was my anecdotal belief, and then you had your polling, and it was cybersecurity, intellectual property. So I just hear what people complain to me about, and I'm brand new in the Senate. I've been in 100 days, and so the extent to which we are making headway in real defined policy ways, I do not know, but I do know that these are issues that we talk about in very public ways on the Foreign Relations Committee. The Foreign Relations Committee is often very well attended by media, including Chinese media. So I know the concerns we express, percolate back, and I'm sure whether it's, Secretary of State or U.S. Trade Rep or, President, Premier, these are issues that are part of the discussion. But we have to find ways to make progress, because if I hear the CEO I was mentioning earlier of a global corporation was not born in the United States. This was somebody who wasn't just advocating a, kind of a U.S. myth. It was just saying, look, every day we are fending off cybersecurity challenges, and we can trace 90% of them back to China, and we know we're right because they're in a technology business. This is what we do. We know where they're coming from. We really do have to address that. And if we did, I think that could have significant positive impact on the relationship.
Okay. I'm going to go to some outside questions. We have a question from an American student at Tsinghua University, and a question for Neil Newhouse. To what extent do you think that stronger advocacy efforts for the Chinese American community might impact the way that China is portrayed in election campaigns? And do you see this, I guess, sort of PR strategy as a potential way to shape a more favorable image of China in the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, I think as a Republican strategist, pollster, I I think our party has not yet paid the kind of attention we need to to Chinese Americans and the Chinese electorate. And I think within the Chinese American community, I think it's important they play a role. I mean, our policy director in the campaign was Chinese American, and yet we didn't really have a strong outreach effort to Chinese Americans across the country. Now, keep in mind, there are key pockets. Virginia was one of the key states that had Asian American influence, but Ohio not so much. And as you point out, in the swing states, not as much. California, we were never going to win California, but as Asian Americans expand across the country, as immigration increases, it's going to be key. And in individual races across the country, it's critical. So I think the Asian American community can play a huge role in that. And we need, you're talking about Matt Fong in California, strong Republican, good guy. We'd like to have seen him. I mean, we'd love to have had him won a major statewide race. And that would have been great. So it's the time is coming, and I think it's going to be in the next 2 to 4 years. But I think we're going to hear a lot more about the rise of Asian American influence in U.S. politics.
Mm-hmm. I think so. Andrew, do you see a way for the Republican Party to regain any of this ground?
Well, as Neil pointed out, and I was surprised to see this, so the Gallup Daily Tracking Data polling only goes back to 2008, where we could really study Asian Americans' political preferences in depth. But if you look back at the exit pollings for the 1992 presidential election, the 1996 presidential election onward, from 1992 and 1996, the Republicans had a clear advantage with the Asian Americans and then started to lose it from 2000, and it's only gotten worse with every successive election. And we in Gallup are embarking on a great project this year to try and better understand Asian Americans' political preference, understand them as a community. And so I look forward to the kind of conclusions we come from there. But just from what we've looked at thus far, it's interesting because Asian Americans, like I said in my comments, have the profile in some sense of what you would call a quote-unquote typical Republican voter. They're, of any racial or ethnic category, they're more likely to earn $90,000 a year or higher, which is more in line with your typical Republican voter. But the one thing that really stands out in our minds and is very interesting is that the lack of religiosity, the lack of especially being Christian, seems to perhaps be something that the Republican Party cannot relate to with Asian Americans. And that's not to say that that's their driving political motivation, but it is interesting that seems to be the one characteristic or attribute that separates them so strongly from the Republican Party, and I do think might play a role in the future.
We have another question here from a German student at Tsinghua University, and the question's somewhat repetitive, but it interested me because it speaks not only of perhaps distortions about China in the U.S. media, but the converse, distortions about the United States in the media in China as this sort of fading superpower that seeks to retain hegemony over in Asia. Stuart, do you have any thoughts about that as to how that might affect Chinese views and also Chinese policy?
Repeat what the student said again.
Well, he speaks about distortions both ways, and not just distortions in the media here about China, but mentions that there are distortions as he sees it as he or she sees it in the Chinese media about the United States, about its intentions in Asian waters, about its belligerence toward China?
Well, as I said, we tracked a lot of the anti-China ads between our Asian American Justice Center and our Asian Pacific American Legal Center. And if the Chinese populace, through its media, republished all of that, they probably would be horrified that the United States just thinks terrible things about China and the Chinese people. I mean, if people saw some of the ads mocking the Asian language, and obviously,
but truthfully, we're horrified at some of that stuff too. I mean, come on. There was, what was the ad in Minnesota? Was the ad in Minnesota? That one?
The Pete Hoekstra ad.
Oh yeah, I mean that was ridiculous.
Yeah, but that's my point.
Yeah.
Is that if they're looking at that and saying that's how America feels about it, that the government feels about it, then it's going to have a very negative effect on the trust. But I don't think, even though, as Andrew said, there's a split opinion about China, I don't think it's that negative. I mean, oh my God, these were just racist ads. Yeah. I mean, I don't know how else to characterize it.
It was.
It was just racist ads.
Yeah.
But you know, some candidates will do anything to get elected. But I think the parties, the people who fund the parties, the people who fund the candidates, they have to say, you know, if you do that, well, first of all, you shouldn't do that. But if you do that, there's going to be repercussions on our whole party.
Well, and then to some extent, Stuart, that's what the voters tell you. I mean,
exactly.
When you go that far,
right.
you know you've crossed that line. And when you cross that line, there's no coming back. There's, you know, there's no redemption after doing something like that.
But I would say, you know, having read, I forgot his name, the policy director for the Republican Party, for the Romney.
Lan He-chen. Yeah.
Yes. I think there is some soul searching in the Republican Party on why they lost the Asian American vote and why it's, went from 31% for the first, for only 31% for President Clinton, a split for Al Gore and George Bush, and then 62% for President Obama in the first election, and now 70+% in the second election. There is some soul searching, but I do think it's more than the messaging. There are policies like healthcare, education, and the economy that did resonate with a cross-section of Asian Americans, but also those images of how you're going to treat newcomers. I think that played a factor.
Is there any prospect, and I'll ask Senator Kaine and then the pollsters, but is there any possibility that the next presidential campaign in 2016 will not present this, will be free of China bashing, will be that it'll be kind of a non-issue the way it was in your campaign, or will there still be the perception, however belied by results? Because I agree with Neil. I think the reason Asian American voters went for President Obama had a lot more to do with health care and other core issues than that. But do you think it's possible that we'll get to that stage by 2016?
It's interesting. I think that future campaigns, both parties are now working on immigration reform together. I think both parties get that, and you're going to see, I believe, the Senate pass with a significant bipartisan margin in the immigration reform bill. And I hope as we do it, we talk about it as a very inclusive for all new Americans. Some of the most prominent pieces of our nation's immigration architecture were actually built around Asian Americans. So the notion of birthright citizenship, which was put into the Constitution after the Civil War to replace the Dred Scott decision, the first major case that established birthright citizenship was a Chinese American, Wong Kim Ark. This is a case in about 1880. I hope if we do immigration reform, we'll emphasize the entire new American story and not just make it about Latinos. I was a missionary in Honduras, and I'm so glad to be doing it for Latinos, but we ought to tell the bigger story, and both parties should do that, and I think we will. But even though the immigration type bashing will probably be off the table in 2016, I would think, to the extent that we're still wrestling with issues like cybersecurity or some behaviors that we're upset about, or to the extent that we haven't gotten comfortable with our own anxiety about our GDP may not be the biggest in the world, you might still see China be an issue for those reasons, even if both sides have decided immigration reform is a good thing.
Gene, I think that if the economy comes around in this country, people are going to forget about everything, all the stuff about outsourcing jobs to China. those concerns will be dissipated, and it may turn on something else like cybersecurity, but the real angst among American workers that we're trying to drive in our campaigns was that concern that they're losing their jobs because of something else. And
right. Well, we're at the end. I'll just close by with a prediction that China and the United States are going to be talking about each other for the rest of our lives, simply because for the rest of our lives we're going to be the two biggest economies in the world, and it just is basically as far out as you can see, and we will be major military powers, and we will have common interests, and we will have interests that don't seem to be so uncommon. But I think Neil is right. I think that as economies are good in one place or the other or both, the relationship and the portrayal of the relationship will be more on the sweetness and light side. And as the economies go south, I think those will be the times when you see the kind of friction that we've seen in the last few years. So get to work, Senator, make the economy better, and everybody else out there. Thank you so much. Thanks so much, and let's have a round of applause for our panel. Thank you.